Greetings all! I am going back to basics here. I have been asked to explain the thinking of the open tops and light armor of American tank destroyers and why the US seemed to go its own way. After all, if you think of German or Soviet TDs, you tend to think of closed-top vehicles of greater armor. Yet, of course, one doesn't have to look far to realize that the Americans were far from the only country to take the open-topped route. So, did they really go their own way? So, if you are going to go and make a tank destroyer, and you want to make it to fit a doctrine, how does the doctrine result in the characteristics of a tank destroyer? That's more or less what I'm going to go over now. The US, of course, was not the first country to conceptualize a tank destroyer. Probably the first country to really put mind to the problem was the country on the receiving end of the things in World War I, Germany. Discussions on a special anti-tank gun called the Tankabwehrkanone, or TAC, started February 1926, albeit as a towed carriage. By May 1927, talk from the Truppenamt, which was the code name for the German General Staff, had moved towards mechanization, either TACs towed by motorized vehicles or directly mounted onto full-tracked chassis. Exactly what this thing was supposed to look like, the staff left for the engineers to figure out. But one of the first examples provided was of a 3.7 centimeter gun on a commercial Hanomag tractor chassis. 1927, the Chef des Heereswaffenamts, whatever, the head of the Army Weapons Development, put out a statement that a class of vehicles named Panzerjäeger, loosely translated as tank destroyers, were the most effective weapons against tanks. These self-propelled guns should be of lowest possible height and maximum possible speed. It was envisioned as a defensive weapon against enemy tank attacks, though at the time the nimbleness was more for the sake of the tactical application against the enemy's tank's sides or rear, though I have to say, given the nature of the tanks as existed at the time, that may not necessarily have been required. That said, the suggestion that a wheel-cum-track may be a suitable alternative to a full track, combined with the thought that a 12-gun battery per division would suffice, seems to imply that the thinking was that they would be a bit more reactionary. Now, this is merely interpretation on my part, made with later knowledge, though, to be clear. Also, and this is a bit of a preview of events that were going to happen about a dozen years later, the chief stated that traditional horse-drawn anti-tank guns wouldn't work because they either wouldn't be where they were needed or they would be so spread out that they would be overwhelmed by a concentrated attack. Ranges of up to 2 kilometers were expected. Now this, by the way, is coming from Panzertracks, if you're curious. Development then started moving towards vehicles capable of mounting either an artillery piece as a self-propelled gun or a 3.7 pack gun. A few prototypes were built, including the light tractor, which was a small enough vehicle that it could mount only the anti-tank gun. It could, however, tootle along at 30 kilometers an hour, which, compared to tanks of the era, wasn't really bad. So, there it sat for a while until late 1934, when 2 more programs were started to create PanzerJaeger, which were faster and more maneuverable than tanks. So I'm now going to go into a long description of requirements quoted from the Army's chief, who used the term offensive tank defense, which you will see again later on the American side. And no, quote begins. The frequently expressed principle that the best defense against a tank is another tank is at least disputed. Bomber aircraft are not employed against heavy bomber aircraft, and let's just ignore that thing from North Africa. Instead, faster and more maneuverable fighter aircraft, presenting a smaller target, are used that only have to be armed in such a way that they can really damage a bomber. At sea, the torpedo boat is fought with a torpedo boat destroyer and the submarine with a submarine destroyer. In both types of destroyers, the most important specification is superior speed and maneuverability, armored only as far as it doesn't interfere with both primary characteristics. Recently, this train of thought by many sailors has reached its peak with the Schnellboot. Apparently, against even the heaviest and largest warships, the Schnellboot is a valuable and dangerous offensive weapon. These very small targets have a considerable speed of about 40 knots and are therefore very difficult to hit. armor is practically renounced. They have fulfilled their role if they can get within effective torpedo firing range undamaged. Even if they are destroyed after achieving their task, their employment is worthwhile even from a purely economic standpoint. But after firing torpedoes, they will frequently succeed in getting away thanks to the characteristics of high speed, maneuverability, and small target area. The question remains whether a tank destroyer can be built exactly corresponding to the fighter aircraft, torpedo boat destroyer, submarine destroyer, and especially the Schnellboot, in which armor is rejected in favor of the following primary characteristics. Very high road speed to achieve good operational mobility. Good cross-country mobility, at least the same as a tank. Cross-country speed and maneuverability greatly superior to a tank. Small target area. Good firing platform for accurate shooting while stationary. Weapons capable of target destruction at ranges from 700 meters up. Cheap and quick mass production in comparison to tanks. The high road speeds, more than double that of a tank, allows anti-tank units to be rapidly sent to threaten the sectors. Unquote. So the idea is here we have a vehicle which is supposed to be small, fast, with a big gun, cheap to make, and optimized to kill tanks. It doesn't specifically state it has to be open-topped, but a lack of a roof does help with these characteristics. So the vehicles that the Germans built next were open-topped, and these were half-track based. They were almost over twice the speed of a tank on road, which, the document stated, allowed anti-tank units to be rapidly sent to threatened sectors. Now, the designs varied from the standard 3.7 centimeter gun to a long-barreled L70 and even a 7.5 centimeter L40.8, the latter two being designed with heavily armored French tanks in mind. These smaller vehicles never entered service, but two of a slightly later variant did, in 1942, go to North Africa to be used as bunker busters, which is a common theme. A number of German vehicles we consider to be tank destroyers were in fact designed to be bunker busters. Thus is the case for the 8.8 on the 12-ton half-track. As a result, there was little emphasis on tactical or operational speed. The open nature of this vehicle was simply more reflection of the weapon. Meanwhile, over on the other side of the Atlantic, the Americans are taking their own look at the problem. A basic anti-tank doctrine issued in 1936 was trialed in 1937 during field exercises by 2nd Division. The director of the exercise and the chief of staff of 2nd Division at the time was a Brigadier General Leslie McNair. You may have heard of him. The major conclusion was that the division needed to be reformed to be triangular, but for anti-tank purposes, not only would each regiment have their own anti-tank company, but the division would have a mobile battalion equipped with its own recon units which could react to enemy threats. The anti-mechanized defense would be in depth. Now, they didn't have the equipment to do it yet, not even towed 37 guns, but they had the general idea. The guns would eventually follow. The US and Germans, though, seem to be the only group really following this line of thinking. The French were absolutely wedded to the towed anti-tank gun, believing it to be the master of the tank attack like the machine gun proved to be against the infantrymen in the Great War. They basically threw all their defenses to hold the line. The question of what to do if the line failed was generally addressed in terms of a conventional unit countermove, not one oriented to deal specifically with armored formations. The background to that generally relates to the French thought on tanks operating without infantry and the ability of the, granted very impressive, French artillery to strip the enemy tanks of their infantry accompaniment. You can have a dig into it. There's an article in the Military Review of May 1976. It's freely available online. The Poles were more willing to consider the concept of a tank fighting vehicle, but didn't really have the resources to throw at the problem, and certainly not at the depth level. Steve Zaloga has done a little bit of writing on that. It's also available online. It would not be until early 1940 that the Germans would return their attentions directly to the Kampfwagenabwehr problem, as they called it at that point. The first of what we may today consider to be true tank destroyers in the American World War II context was the PanzerJaeger 1. The operational requirement was, in effect, to stop French tank attacks by heavily armored beasties such as the Char B-1. If you look at their instructional manual, It states that these Schnelle PanzerJaeger are unique in their continual readiness to fire, high cross-country mobility, and armor protection. They are therefore qualified to combat enemy tanks by attacking. Now, one may wonder about this description, but compared to the standard towed anti-tank gun, it was still better in all three respects. Now, here's an important line from the manual. Unhindered observation with an open top allows early recognition and engagement of enemy tanks which have limited vision. It's the old see first, shoot first, hit first thing. Basis of issue was to be 1 battalion per division, usually a panzer division, but 1 battalion per division. It was expected that the unit would be employed by company, but the manual does say that employment by battalion would be useful in many situations. If you look at the tactics, when the Panzer Division is on the defense, or whatever division they're attached to, the PanzerJaegers are held in reserve and will not be sent into action until the direction of the enemy tank attack is identified. The task is to destroy the enemy tanks which have penetrated into the battlefield. When the unit is on the offense, it has the primary task of securing the flanks in front against enemy tank attack. The manual always talks about how the PanzerJaegers engage attacking enemy tanks. It says very little about enemy tanks which are not attacking, even when they are directly supporting an attacking panzer brigade. As a secondary function, they can engage anti-tank guns and fortifications. So if you see my US tank destroyer video, this is all going to be very familiar to you. Just most of the above was originally written in German, not in English in what would become FM 18-5. A month after the PanzerJaeger manual was published, that I just quoted, you then have the oh crap moment of the fall of France, when it was discovered that things like a doctrine of having an anti-tank gun for every 100 meters of frontage, such as the French had, was not going to be enough. The British suddenly aren't in a position to be able to come up with novel concepts. They're just being stretched to build whatever they already had approved. The Americans, though, have the opportunity to chew upon this with something of a lesser time crunch. By late 1940, it was concluded that a frontal defense wasn't going to work, and the Field Service Regulations of 1941 stated that they wanted to have a minimum of AT guns up front and a maximum in a mobile reserve. These are, of course, still all towed. Still, though, more mobile guns were required. Enter in mid-1941 a Major Rademeyer, graduate of the Kriegsakademie, but whether he was influenced by German anti-tank thought of the matter is unknown, but he felt that the bulk of anti-tank units were to be pooled at higher headquarters in highly mobile, centrally located groups. By the way, just to make it clear, he's an American officer. The primary weapon would be a mobile, heavily gunned tank chaser. So again, we're talking speed and guns more than anything else. Due to the lack of any particular progress, General Marshall set up an anti-tank conference headed by then Colonel Bruce in July 1941. The description of the vehicle which they desired was thus. Again, quote, "We are after a fast-moving vehicle armed with a weapon with a powerful punch, which can be easily and quickly fired. And in the last analysis, we would like to get armored protection against small arms fire so that this weapon cannot be put out by machine guns." The idea that we have in mind is, in reality, similar to the battlecruiser. Its tactics in operating against the tanks, well, the battleship in this analogy, have to be different from the tactics which we had employed in operating the tank, or battleship, against the tank, or battleship. Speed, visibility, and hitting power of the tank destroyer should compensate to some degree for its lack of armor. Unquote. Now, by this point, the Army had started investigating the possibility of a self-propelled anti-tank gun with a number of wheeled carriages with a 37mm gun. However, it was time to lay out official required characteristics in a more formal manner, as opposed to just throwing designs at the wall to see what stuck. A requirement for a light tank destroyer was put out within 2 weeks by Army G4, signed by a General Twaddle. They wanted, quote, "a self-propelled mount for the 37mm anti-tank gun in a light, highly mobile, fast, lightly armored cross-country vehicle having a low silhouette. This vehicle must be capable of being manufactured by mass production methods at minimum cost." Then there was a whole slew of physical characteristics, starting with, again, quote, "simple in design, relatively cheap, and capable of mass production due to use of standard automotive tractor parts. This is a major requirement." Unquote. Armor protection was listed as protection against the .50 caliber at 250 yards, and armor to be of sufficient height to give all-around protection to the gun crew when in firing position. Top armor was specified as none. Long-distance speed was to be greater than or equal to any of the light tanks on all grades in road, with cross-country speed equal to the M3 Light. There were a slew of other requirements, but those are the relevant ones to this particular discussion. 2 weeks later, another characteristics sheet went out looking for a vehicle from 57mm to 3-inch, which may perhaps also be used in as an assault gun. Quote, "There is a military requirement for a self-propelled vehicle capable of mounting a more formidable weapon than the 37mm anti-tank gun. It is visualized that this heavier type mount will be used primarily to reinforce the lighter vehicles." G2 reports are continuously being received indicating the fallacy of sending expensive unarmored fighting vehicles to operate on the modern battlefield. The use of a shield only is extremely ineffective, according to our reports, and all countries are increasing the area of armor on anti-tank and assault artillery weapons. As in the case of large and expensive tanks, this vehicle will not be produced in numbers comparable to the lighter type due to increased cost and the additional time required for manufacture. Again, by the way, unquote, again, armor was not to be placed on the roof, and it was to be high enough only to protect the men inside. In the end, the two vehicles would be the 37mm gun motor carriage M6 and the 75mm gun motor carriage M3. Though, contrary to the initial thinking, the heavy caliber gun would be the primary vehicle, and soon the folly of the 37 in any shape or form would be completely made clear, and then the vehicle removed entirely. So again, the lack of a roof will not only lighten the weight, but even go as far as to make the mount cheaper. Now, around this time, the British start playing around with porte mounts for the 2-pounder. Now, these were simply a solution to a technical problem. The wheels on the 2-pounder carriage apparently weren't sufficiently rugged to be bouncing around, towed on the rough North African terrain. Officially, they weren't to be fired from the back of the truck, but in practice, they often were. The 6-pounder Deacon was built to be fired from the truck, but that's something of a bodge of a vehicle, which didn't really last after North Africa. Come 1942, American thinking on the matter is more or less as follows. Quote, "The destroyer's gun and mount don't have the tank's armor, but its crew commands greater speed, visibility, maneuverability, and at least equal firepower. It can pick the time and place to deliver its punch and then hightail it to a new position to strike again." Another doctrinal term, by the way, hightail. If I tried using that in the ILE course or Captain's Career course, it'd murder me, but there's precedent. One good tank destroyer can be produced for materially less than the cost of a tank and in far less time with less critical materials. Thus would be the case for not only the M10 but also M36, and to a large extent the M18, which wasn't actually much cheaper than the tank but was certainly more mobile, faster, and had more visibility. The M18's kill rate by the end of the war is an indicator of the success of the vehicle. Of course, the Americans are now going all in on turrets, and they are not entirely alone in doing so. The Germans are trying to figure out how to put their AT guns in a 360-degree traverse mount as well, such as on the RSO or the Waffenträgers. These are not proving particularly successful. The RSOs have too little protection to begin with, and the Martyrs, well, they're more sort of an expedient SPG. Hornisse Nashorn, however, is a purpose-designed vehicle. They gave up on the Traverse to have armor on all sides, but without the roof again. Ideal method of operation per an instruction sheet from late 1943. The Schwere PanzerJaeger Abteilung Hornisse is the mobile defense for the command to concentrate against enemy tank attacks. Employ as an Abteilung or a company. So, again, what they're doing is they're maintaining their function similar to US tank destroyers or the PanzerJaegers before, just supposedly at company level. Then the Germans lost the plot a bit. The first two vehicles, which are considered as tank destroyers with heavy armor and a roof, are Ferdinand and Jagdpanzer IV, but they actually don't really count because they were both developed as Sturmgeschütz, and was an entirely different role. Indeed, Jagdpanther also started its development in 1943 as an 8.8 centimeter assault gun before being turned into a medium PanzerJaeger. We're going to ignore Jagdtiger as just plain idiocy. Around this time also, the British are looking at making their own vehicles. The ideal one also has an open-topped traversing turret, and this would be Avenger. In the meantime, the SP Valentine, or also known as Archer, was built, no turret, but again an open top. They are using M10s in the meantime. The British, though, have a slightly different purpose in mind. They are not reactionary tank destroyers in the German or the American sense of the concept. They are in regiments mixed in with the towed guns and are literally self-propelled anti-tank guns, much like the German RSO with the PaK-40. Their advantage is in speed of emplacement and displacement. So, for example, after the British secure an objective, or at least they seize it, an M10 can then drive forward and become an immediate self-emplacing anti-tank foxhole. After a while, the towed guns can be emplaced to replace it. So remember, it would take 12 to 15 hours to properly emplace a towed 17-pounder gun. An M10 can be reasonably well in place in under an hour. So why is the advantage of a turret? Well, imagine you've just moved into a position and have now spent time digging in, maybe 12 to 15 hours, and concealing the vehicle along the most likely enemy avenue of approach. All is well if the enemy cooperates and comes at you from the front, your expected route of advance. A problem poses itself, however, if the enemy comes at you from the side, requiring traversing the vehicle and all your camouflage falling off, even if you dug in position and had the space to turn. In effect, a platoon of turreted vehicles can engage as a group any targets in any direction, more or less, whereas a platoon of turretless vehicles are either forced to engage piecemeal with some guns unable to bear, or the whole lot of them have to turn, and then they lose their advantages of the prepared position. Now, of course, there is a disadvantage to not having a roof. Germans started to fall in love with mortars. The Soviets were very well in love with artillery as a whole to begin with, and in love or not, the British and the Americans in particular are extremely effective with their artillery. When in places that the Germans were able to rain down indirect upon a static line, such as in Italy and particularly Anzio, the Americans started to provide improvised roofs for their M10s and wrote home to Ordnance to please issue armoured covers. Ordnance did indeed look into developing them and created armoured roofs for all three of its vehicles, although only the M18 and the M36 seem to have been officially approved for production. Note that the roofs were still to be sufficiently high as to allow the crew to see reasonably well whilst still obstructed, so they're not confined to periscopes. They were also high enough that they did not interfere with the loading process of the ammunition. Indirect fire was the primary concern for these armoured covers, but so was small arms in built-up areas that it was expected that these vehicles may be fighting in Europe. As a result, not only was the vehicle designed to resist artillery from the top, but they went as far as to test the effects of small arms fired through the gap, maybe ricocheting down off of from the top of the roof. A special splash guard had to be installed, which solved that problem. That said, the field troops seemed less worried by this latter problem because you don't see the roofs very much in Europe. By this time, though, the war was almost over, so you will only really see the roofs on post-war M36s. The British apparently came to a similar conclusion, with a roof with a gap developed for both Archer and Avenger. The Germans, as mentioned, gave Jagdpanther a pretty solid armour, and the Jagdpanzer 38T also had a roof, but again, they were on the receiving end of both effective artillery and effective airstrikes, so it may well have been worth the hassle and the penalties. So there you go, that's why tank destroyers generally ended up looking the way that they did. If you want to learn more, at least from the American side, feel free to buy the book, Can Openers, written by me, if you haven't seen it already. And otherwise, I hope you found it generally interesting and informative, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.